Okay, we're recording, so I hope everybody can see this. Hi, everybody. My name is Jack Burt. I am the trumpet professor at the University of Maine. I am a Schagel artist, and as some of you may know, I've posted a lot on YouTube about Rotary trumpets, and I get lots of questions and information about it. And I thought, given the friendship that we've developed over the past few years, that it would be great to do an interview with Micah Wilkinson, principal trumpet of the Pittsburgh Symphony, who is a very positive Rotary person. And so we're going to talk all things Rotary today and hopefully answer a lot of questions and talk about these horns and specifically their role in American orchestras and what we do with them here. Everybody knows about European orchestras and their approach to rotaries, but let's talk about America. So first, Micah, give us a short little bio about yourself.
Well, hey, Jack, thanks for doing this. This is
Pleasure.
great to spend some time together again. Yeah, so I play principal trumpet in Pittsburgh. I've been here for about 7.5 years, something like that. Before that, I bounced around various orchestras in different positions. So I came from the San Diego Symphony, was principal trumpet for about 3 years there. But before that, I played acting second in the Houston Symphony. I played acting second in the San Francisco Symphony. I played third trumpet for a while in the Oregon Symphony, second trumpet in the Tucson Symphony, straight out of, well, I left grad school for that. I went to a small college in Minnesota, St. Olaf College, liberal arts college. During that time, my junior year of college, I traveled to Freiburg, Germany, and studied for a semester with Tony Ploeg and just fell in love with the environment there. We can get into that more later and kind of how that was part of my influence in Rotary trumpet land. But then after that, I studied for a year with David Hickman at Arizona State. I grew up in Atlanta, in the Atlanta suburbs, Norcross, Georgia. And yeah, I love getting to do my dream job here in Pittsburgh.
That's great. You and I, we've only met 3 times. I figured this
That's
out.
hard to believe, really.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, it's kind of like one of the few good things about Facebook that's left is that Facebook had a lot to do with our relationship. But we met at an ITG conference at a table and started chatting.
Yep,
Well, we discovered that we both went to the Round Top Festival in Texas, and we
yep,
both met our wives there. So
yeah,
that was something.
yeah.
Who did you work with at Round Top? Who was there then? Was it
For
Billboard?
trumpet, it was from the Houston Symphony and the Dallas Symphony. So we had Tom Booth from the Dallas Symphony
Yep.
and John DeWitt from the Houston Symphony, both of whom are retired now.
Tom Booth, a Baldwin Wallace graduate.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
And so we both spent time. You and I both spent time in Germany. You did it with Tony in Freiburg, and I was a student in Berlin in the '80s,
Yeah.
which is kind of where I made my choice to be a trumpet player as opposed to musicologist.
Hmm.
We've been friends for a long time. During the pandemic, we talked a lot about recordings.
Yeah.
We bought my wife still curses your name because of all the box sets that I bought from eBay and different places.
Yeah, see,
So
see, you've got yours on display behind you, but mine are a little off to the left here. So those are the box sets there.
oh, mine aren't even in the house. Those are just random ones I have in my office. All my
Yeah,
big
right.
boxes are at home. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, if you were to name your favorite CD box, what would it be?
Oh, geez. Um,
Because you love buying old recordings
yeah.
and compilations and stuff.
Honestly, the ones that have gotten the most listens for me that I enjoy the most are the ones put out by specific orchestras that are radio broadcasts
Oh yeah,
through the years that you can't really find, that weren't commercial releases, but that they've remastered and that are high quality. So
they're very radio,
um,
right?
I've got a great Chicago Symphony has a couple of those sets that I have that are really great. Boston Symphony has um, a Centennial Celebration box. Philadelphia Orchestra has a nice set, and the Cleveland Orchestra has a nice set. I think those are the ones that I have, and I think those are my favorite, just because you
Yeah,
really get an impression of what a live concert was like,
back in the
and
day.
you can kind of go through the history of it and pick out who the different players were at different times and how the sound of an orchestra changed with different music directors over different decades.
Yeah, that kind of described basically what I did with my previous sabbatical when I did all those interviews with the different members of the orchestra, and we talked about the trumpet sections over time
Yeah,
and how they changed. You know, it's like Cleveland Lake was one sound throughout just about, and Boston changed with every principal,
right.
and Philly became, you know, had its changes. That shit's fast.
It's really fascinating.
That
Yeah.
stuff is fascinating. Well, good.
Bleep.
So, also then to continue with our relationship real quick, as I drove to Pittsburgh one year right after the pandemic and heard you guys do Bruckner 7, which was
Yeah.
wonderful. That's the first time we had met since that ITG. And then this fall, when I was on sabbatical in Vienna, we hung out for a few days. I went to your fabulous concert you guys did in the concert house with Mahler 1
Hmm.
and the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto with Anna Zofi and the Short Ride,
Yep.
which was really fun. I mean,
Yep.
that was a great concert, and you could tell by the enthusiasm of the audience that it was really well received. The Viennese are very polite audiences. They're except for the operas where they boo, but they appreciate everything. But this was well beyond just normal. Hey, that was a good concert. They were stoked,
Yeah.
as was I. And then we went to Breselmeyer and
Hmm.
had some fun at the Mouthpieces, and then also went to Chagarl and visited the
Yeah.
Chagarl factory.
Yeah.
So that's us, which is, you know, the great thing about Facebook and trumpets is that you meet a trumpet player, you have a million things in common. So, like, onward now, on to what we wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
I would like you to talk about, if you wouldn't mind first, your first exposure where you actually were conscious of rotary trumpets and what your impression was when you heard them or played them.
I was vaguely aware of them early in college because I remember the music director of the Minnesota Orchestra, Osmo Vanska, was trying to get the trumpet section to play rotaries more and on, more chromatic things like Mahler symphonies. And so they were butting heads over that. And I remember just kind of hearing about that and sort of associating, like absorbing that, okay, this must be like a real challenge and something to maybe that I'm going to have to resist because, a music director might try to impose this on me. And then I studied in Germany. I mean, I really don't think I had I much exposure that I can think of. I certainly didn't. I don't think we had a rotary trumpet at St. Olaf College to play on. No, that's not true. We did have a couple of them. We did
Yeah.
because there was a orchestra tour that we went on, and um, they did Brahms Haydn variations, and I didn't play it, but a couple of the other trumpet players were playing it on the tour, and I remember there was a clarinetist who came up to me in the orchestra and said, "Hey, I used to play trumpet. How do these work? Can I try it?" And I said, "Sure." And of course, it wasn't even my instrument to be playing on the tour. It was this other colleague of mine. And I handed it to the clarinet player, and I turned my back, and then I heard thud. Oh no! And turned around, and he dropped it straight down onto the mouthpiece, which had like bent the receiver and totally damaged the horn in the middle of the tour
So you
and
broke a horn you weren't even playing.
yeah, well, I didn't break it, but it's strange, like you invite me to think about these early memories and now they start flooding back because the other mishap I had with early rotaries was when I was at Arizona State and they had a pair of Gonter instruments that were outdated. They were difficult to play, and at least for us. And on the day of our concert that we had with Andre Watts, which was for us a very big deal, and we were playing a Beethoven or Brahms piano concerto, so we were using rotaries. And that morning I woke up to go to campus and my car had been stolen and I had left the school's rotary trumpet in the car and the music for the concert. So it was gone. Everybody was um, really upset with me. My car had been stolen, and I'd grown up in this like very safe, trusting environment of St. Olaf, and then I show up in Phoenix and everything gets stolen. But anyway, the school ended up replacing it with a new tine that Hickman was really excited about. So eventually everyone thanked me for that because they got an upgrade. Um,
You did it on
but
purpose.
anyway, when I was in Germany, I think that was probably my first exposure, regularly to rotary trumpets. But I wasn't studying with a German, Tony Ploeg, and I wasn't, specifically like trying to seek out rotary trumpet advice. I was just sort of studying music, and in the class there, I think we only had maybe one or two Germans, and so people were coming from all over, and most of them were not playing rotary trumpets primarily. And when I went and visited other classes like Klaus Schuwerk's class in Basel, even there, when we had a studio class, most of the people were holding the Perronnet trumpets. And so it was kind of
Yeah, well,
surprised me.
both those studios are not necessarily known for being orchestral centers. They're
Yeah,
more soloistic.
right,
Um, so,
right.
but that's interesting that it's kind of drifted here and there with you. You've become, and I'd describe you to people as probably the most rotary friendly principal trumpet in the U.S. So how did that come about?
I think the more I played them, the more I fell in love with it. And I got great feedback from my colleagues and from people in the audience, from conductors who liked it. And um, after I was in Germany, I did buy my first rotary, which was a B flat Rico Kuhn, thinking that I was going to go back to Germany and move there, and I was going to need a B flat for auditioning for orchestras there on the Haydn. And so even some of my first American orchestra auditions, I used that B flat rotary on excerpts like Mahler 5. Um, so I think I had an immediate affinity for the instrument. Eventually, I drifted away from B flat and sold that and worked my way through various C rotaries. Um, but for me now, it's a sound that I really identify with, and it connects me to the rest of the orchestra in a way that I feel like I can lead without necessarily separating myself. So it's more integrated, um, and um, there's just a different dimension of sound that I feel like I can access with them.
It's like adding
And
a tool to your toolbox.
yeah, yeah, it's a different voice altogether, it feels
Yeah.
like.
I remember the first time I had a rotary. I took it to an orchestra, and I can't remember what we were playing. It wasn't anything special, but we were directly behind the viola section, and I started just warming up, playing a few arpeggios, and this viola player's head just went like this. And she turned around, she goes, "What is that?" I explained. She goes, "It doesn't hurt."
Yeah,
I said, "Yeah, it's a different sound, isn't it?
yeah,
It's not nearly as penetrating, but
yeah,
it's like a warm bath." She goes, "It's going around." She literally said this. It goes around me rather than through me.
yeah.
And I was like, "You can't describe it better than that."
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's an
So,
enveloping sound. Yeah.
so when you're in Pittsburgh, what are your choices when it comes to like repertoire? I know you've played Mahler on tour on Rotaries, which is for an American orchestra unusual.
Right. Right. Yeah, um that's sort of the extent of it for us right now. We certainly use them on Beethoven and Brahms and Schumann um and then we have also been using them on more chromatic repertoire like Bruckner and Wagner, some Strauss,
Mhm.
Sibelius, and um, and now Manfred Honeck has requested. It was the previous tour, right as we were about to leave. He asked us to play Mahler 1 on Rotaries, and we switched, and I loved it. There,
Great.
aside from some challenges in the fourth movement that with mute changes and things that we were that made it more difficult, especially in the first three movements.
Yeah.
We just loved the sound we were getting, and you know everybody who came up to us in the orchestra talked about how much they loved it. Honeck was
I
happy.
I always had a feeling that somebody talked to Mahler after the first symphony about his mutes.
Yeah,
Because he doesn't do nearly as much switching. It's
it's
like
true.
you're like
Yeah,
a young composer, right?
yeah.
Yeah, that was really wonderful. I was thinking while you were talking about Tony Plug. He interviewed Pasi
Yeah,
Perriman, and he
yeah.
was talking about even in Sibelius that Sibelius was premiered with rotary trumpets. That back in the day
Mm,
in Helsinki they were playing rotary trumpets, and
mm,
so Sibelius is. I don't think I when I do master classes about this stuff, I don't think there's anything right or wrong. It's a question
yeah,
of what you like, but I think
right,
there's an appropriateness to the sound. You can get that
right.
thick, broad, kind of heavy motto feeling that you get in a lot of Sibelius. It
Yeah,
works really well.
right. For me, at this point, it is about the sound and what I think is going to be most appropriate, and I try not to be dogmatic about it. Oh, because it's this composer, we need to do it this way, or because it's. I'm certainly breaking with some tradition here, so it's
Yeah,
not about like what's always been done here.
yeah,
And so I was just kind of, it's not willy-nilly, but it is when it's on the cusp, then I try to talk to my colleagues about it and see
yeah.
how would you feel if we did, such and such Strauss tone poem on Rotaries this time. Um, and there are certainly added challenges, but um, so far, I think, I mean, I think there was some pushback when we did Mahler 5,
Mm.
uh, just because um,
The
it's
comfort issue.
such a change
Yeah,
from, and certainly the traditional Pittsburgh Symphony brass sound. If you change the trumpets you're playing, then you're changing the whole sound of the brass
yeah,
and really the sound of the orchestra. And so you're opting for a different color palette altogether. Um, and so that was a challenge, but Mahler 5, especially in those halls in Europe, um, I would do it the same way again.
yeah. Yeah, I think the comfort, it's like, especially people with jobs. It's perfectly understandable to be hesitant about switching a horn in a high stress situation. But what I wanted to talk then is about auditions, because one of the issues that we talked about before we started is rotary trumpets and auditions. Where is it required? Where is it suggested? Um, I'd be interested in one with Pittsburgh. What is the system with auditions as far as
Hmm.
trumpets? And talk about any trumpet experiences. Excuse me, experiences you had in auditions with rotary trumpets,
Hmm.
whether it was required or not, and maybe just give some basic advice to younger college age students about how to get started on this if they haven't already, because it's going to be a lot of your job.
Yeah, right. It is a lot of my job. You were mentioning that earlier, that virtually everything I've recorded in any orchestra, second trumpet, first trumpet, has been on rotary. The Chike 5 that we released just recently, I think, is one of the only things that's out there with me on piston. Um, and So it is a significant chunk of what we do. And so it's important that we evaluate that in the auditions. There are certainly other U.S. orchestras that don't use them as much, and so they wouldn't feel the need to require them in auditions. Or they might say, you see sometimes on audition lists, Rotary preferred for certain excerpts. For us, um, we just had an associate principal audition that Conrad Jones won, and there were a number of excerpts where Rotary was indeed required. Um, and so it's a hurdle. You do have to have the instrument and you have to have experience with it, but it is a major part of the job. And if we have another position open, I don't really want to bring someone in who has no experience on Rotary. Um, so I would say, in my own audition experience, I think it does depend on what the orchestra is requesting. And if an orchestra has a bunch of excerpts and they don't say anything about Rotary, then if you're a young player and just kind of getting to know the Rotary, I wouldn't use it. I would just
Right.
play it all on piston. They don't care. They don't. That doesn't matter to them enough to mention it on the audition. If you feel on the Rotary that you are able to play certain things better because of just the way the instrument blows, or because the sound that you have in your head is more closely matched by the rotary trumpet on certain excerpts, then, and that's certainly true for me now, a handful of excerpts are just going to go way worse for me on the piston than they are on the rotary because that's how I hear it. And so when I try to play it on the piston, I'm trying to do a rotary thing, which I can get close, but I'm trying to do something that it's not quite meant to do.
Yeah.
And so if you're at that place where you feel like this is just going to go better on a rotary trumpet because it feels and sounds right, then do it, whether or not they ask for it. I would say, and then the thing about U.S. orchestras and auditions is that clarity, intonation, evenness of sound, these are real high priorities for a lot of committees. And so it's kind of like a clean approach. And so if by switching to rotary, you introduce another variable that causes you to play a little more out of tune, or for it to just like to untrained ear, let's say a person on the committee who's not a brass player, doesn't know anything about rotary, and just hears like, huh, that sounds kind of funny. Like, why is that different? Then that could raise a red flag,
Yeah.
especially if it's not really clear and clean and in tune and even. And so on a lesser quality rotary, you could run into trouble with that. On a bad mouthpiece horn combination, you could run into trouble with that. And if you just aren't that comfortable on the instrument too. So that's something to watch out for.
Good. Well, I actually got ahead of myself a little bit with my questions. I put them in the wrong order. And now so before you get to an audition, you've got to start playing a rotary trumpet. What kind of what do you recommend to people about starting out on a rotary trumpet, preparing for audition, getting comfortable with the instrument,
Mhm.
uh, figuring out what the differences are and the best way to approach? I mean, this is a big target. I
Yeah.
remember in an interview, Gabor Tarkovi grew up playing piston trumpets in Hungary, and he said it took him 6 years to be comfortable on a rotary, but he knew he had to if he was going to work in Germany.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think everybody needs 6 years, but there's definitely a getting used to it factor that is important that people deal with. So
Right.
if you got a student who's looking to go do auditions eventually and wants to get and has no background on rotary trumpet, what are the kind of things you would recommend to them?
I mean, honestly, I don't think it's all that different than picking up a C trumpet for the first time, moving from B flat. It feels different, and I would just say to somebody who's switching to C trumpet, well, do your warm-up routine on C trumpet. Play C trumpet in all the ensembles that you can and learn that, transposition and play with other people. And so for a rotary, do your fundamentals routine on it. Play with your friends and colleagues, and see how it lines up with intonation. And if you have ensembles that you can plug in, then play it there. Play it as much as possible. Um, Record yourself and see if what you think you're producing is what's coming out. It might be different, especially from a distance. And and then don't expect just to be able to plug in, your piston mouthpiece and play and not think about it.
Yeah.
It is different, and so it requires mostly, I think, a different expectation, different set of ears for what kind of sound you want. If you want the exact same sound, then what's the point? And so if you are willing to sort of embrace that the instrument I'm holding is going to produce a different sound than I'm used to, then then that's a good start.
And when I describe rotary trumpet versus piston to people, I talk a lot about just my concept of air changes, where I feel like on a piston I'm pushing and driving, and on a rotary I feel like I'm kind of yawning or fogging a mirror. I want my air to be a lot more just kind of gentle, so I don't overblow the instrument because it's a
Hmm.
narrower horn. What
Hmm.
do you think? What are your if you with students that you've had or people that you've worked with? What are the kind of stumbling blocks that people have had in developing a good rotary abilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit exactly what I would have said. Just that um, the resistance is different. The the way that the sound emanates from the horn is less direct, and so um, I always think that you breathe in the sound you want to create, and so if your breath in reflects the sound that you want on the rotary, then you're heading in the right direction. Then that's going to help with the exhale, the release of the sound, um, and so that yawn type breath and relaxed um, approach can help with balance. Um, I think the way that the notes change on the rotary is different. The actual valve action is different, and so sort of the there's this natural kind of gooey portamento that happens with a
Like a fluff,
piston.
fluff, fluff, fluff. Yeah.
Wow, that you get when you're in no man's land in between the valve changes, and you can learn to use that to your advantage on a piston to create a legato, a portamento, and so just the feel of that is different. And on a rotary, there's almost a percussive quality to the valve change when you're blowing against it. It's more immediate. And so the way to play legato on a rotary feels quite different.
Mhm.
You kind of use the valves and blow against them a little bit, not in a direct, forced kind of air way, but a constant sort of pressure on the valve block with your hot
And
air.
and it's just the simple mechanics of the valve throw being like about two-thirds the distance of
Right,
a piston, right? I mean,
right,
the distance is less,
right.
and in some ways it can be really confusing
Yeah.
because your sense of rhythm changes with the way the valves move.
Mm-hmm.
That takes time to get used
Yeah.
to. I've always been surprised, and people are surprised at what is easier on rotors
Mm-hmm.
than pistons. You
Mm-hmm.
know, when you trill a C to D,
Mm-hmm.
third space C to a D on a B flat trumpet or a C trumpet, that's some work
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
get those two notes to speak. On a rotary trumpet, it's like they're the same note. You can just
Yeah.
flip them and F to G, G to A.
Yeah.
You know, things that you might not think were, because when I grew up, rotaries were sluggish. You had
Yeah.
the old valve systems, and the
Yeah.
Moncas were really heavy, and people said, "Oh, those are just so tubby," and to a certain extent they were. But the modern rotaries are built with such precision that this kind of light, fluffy, well, even not fluffy, clear, but
Yeah.
gentle
Yeah.
movement within the valves totally outpaces what you can get done on a piston in some
Yeah.
cases. Opposite
It's
is
really
true on other
remarkable.
things.
Yeah. That is it, you're right. It is surprising. Um, and I think, then because of the valve action, like you said, the timing, like when you're adding articulation, then that coordination just requires some work. So
Yeah.
some Clark studies with articulation, some scalar type things. And of course, intonation tendencies are going to be different. And so spending some time with drones and tuners and playing with reliable colleagues to kind of see, oh, like that's where the middle G is. That's not where I'm used to it
Yeah.
being. That's important.
I remember, this is a funny confession, that just you get used to playing a certain way,
Yeah.
right? I was working on an audition for something, and I was going to play pictures, and I was playing it on a rotor for whatever reason. I don't know why. I wouldn't do it normally. Um, and my colleague was listening to me. He said, Jack, your low Ds are really flat. I'm like, how can they be flat? I mean, it's like this thing doesn't even go out as far as like a
Yeah.
Bach or. But he's like, yeah, it's really flat. And then when you really get down to it, you don't really have to move that third valve slide very much on a rotary to get the
Hmm.
D in tune. It's
Hmm.
like basically it's like an eighth of an inch, and
Hmm.
that D and top, because the top D is not that flat, and the
Hmm.
low D is not that sharp. And
Hmm.
it's like I was just doing what I did with my
Yeah.
Bach C all my life, and not paying any attention because
Hmm.
this is how you play pictures. You kick out the
Hmm.
slide for D.
Hmm.
And he's like, no, Jack's really flat. And so, yeah, this I getting cataloging the differences in pitch. That
Yeah.
G is funky,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially on a C,
Yeah.
and a lot of guys just can't. There's G's wrong,
Yeah.
but so many other things are better,
Yeah.
you
Right.
know.
Yeah.
And the like this as well as I do. Like the options you have on four space E on a C
Hmm.
trumpet
Yeah.
are fascinating, and how differently European players finger it. You
Right.
know, I'm watching Berlin Philharmonic, Guillaume and Gabor and now David, and the amount of third valve E's you see
Yeah.
in ways that you wouldn't think were very comfortable, but
Yeah.
nevertheless they do, which you would never dream of doing on a piston because it just
Right.
doesn't work, right?
Right.
So the horns are different; they're
Yeah.
not the same, and
Right.
there's a lot of things that have advantages and then disadvantages. What would be disadvantages in your mind on things that you have to overcome when you learn to play rotary?
Um, well, I think some people have a hard time getting clarity in the articulation on a rotary. Um, and it could be because they just sort of assume that it's not supposed to be clear. But um, I, or, the instrument isn't in balance or something. But um, I think that there can be a lot of ring right to the front of the note. Um, I think for most people the big problem is the way that the sound changes when you get loud and sort of how to do that. And so on a piston, there's a way that you kind of throttle the air. And I don't think that way when I'm playing. I don't think like, all right, I'm going to get louder now, so I'm going to throttle the air. I just am thinking about the sound that I want, and I'm anticipating and expecting the sound to get more ringy and free and brilliant or exciting and zingy. But there's a little different color palette for what I would expect on a piston than what I would expect on a rotary. Um, and I would say on a piston, you can kind of imagine it going forward a little bit more than on a rotary, where it almost like you can kind of sense it expanding.
Mhm.
And so if you try to get loud on the rotary like you would on a piston, then it has diminishing returns. Usually endurance and sound suffer.
You get
And
that
I've heard
squealing
that so
sound.
many times in auditions. Somebody plays like a long blow, and I've done this a lot, like something from Götterdämmerung that's or Bruckner 7, something that's like a several lines of music that you're playing by yourself in an audition, and you're used to a certain kind of feedback from the piston that gets exciting at a certain point. And the rotary, um, because of the different colors and the difference in the resistance, you can end up like overplaying the instrument too soon. And when you need to crescendo for another line, there's nothing left in the tank.
Yeah,
Um, so, and I think that the upper register also has kind of an expansive quality to it. It is a less direct instrument. And so, um, allowing it to do what it wants to do, what it does well, then you can free those things up.
I remember in an interview, not one I did with him, but an interview, Gabor talked about the sound of a rotary trumpet. And he's like, everybody talks about the dark German sound. He says, it doesn't exist. There is no dark German trumpet sound. The rotary trumpet is broad. It's
Hmm.
not dark.
Hmm.
It's actually brighter, and
Hmm.
it can be very bright when you
Hmm.
want it to be.
Hmm.
A long time ago, I wrote an article about rotary trumpets in the ITG. It's 20 years ago, I think.
Hmm.
And one of the things I said is that you know, the the sound of a rotary trumpet goes from kind of muffled or fluffy and woolly to almost molten, from
Yeah.
pianissimo to fortissimo, and that's what they want. The advantage of that on the rotary trumpet is exactly what you're not looking for in a piston trumpet. You want a characteristic sound that goes from pianissimo to fortissimo without much change.
Hmm.
So the disadvantage of one is the advantage of the other, and vice
Right.
versa.
Right.
And we, you know, that's a hard thing to get your ears around when you're just starting to learn these instruments.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think going back to what you said from the very beginning is doing your routine, doing your basic stuff on these. You're not going to forget how to play a piston,
Right.
right? You grew up with it. It's home, but you've got to be comfortable on these horns so that when it gets to the point where you're playing them under pressure, they feel like home as well.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah, and I don't know if this is getting ahead of myself, but the I think you have to learn how to switch to it. And that's certainly a trick for auditions. It also happens in, the profession. We play shows where, like a gala or something like that, and so there are these short tunes, and the fourth tune on the show is on Rotary, and you grab it quick and you play that tune, and then you put it down and you continue on piston, or vice versa. And so being able to switch comfortably is a skill that you need to develop. And certainly in auditions, to be able to pick something up and play it without test notes, and just to play Brahms Academic or Schumann 2 or whatever the excerpt is.
I remember once I had to play in an audition. I had to play Parsifal followed by Petrushka.
Yeah.
And it did not go well. The second, I just couldn't. That was like, really, this is what you want? I was griping about that. Because, I mean, the auditions put you in situations that are many times more intense and changeable than the real job.
Right.
But the real job still has things like you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's go to the controversial part of this thing. Talk about mouthpieces.
Oh, yeah.
What is your philosophy about mouthpieces and rotary trumpets? Because everybody's got their own, and you and I have ours. And I think the road you've taken and what you're doing with them. You said something earlier about if you don't want it to sound different, why bother, or what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
And I understand the idea of people wanting to just do as little as possible for safety's sake and play the rotary because it looks different and the conductor's happy and nobody really cares about the sound.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you really do care about what you sound like and creating a different sound, my own opinion is a mouthpiece really matters, matching mouthpiece to horn. What's been your journey on mouthpieces with rotaries?
Yeah. I got a Breselmeyer G2 as sort of my first rotary mouthpiece. When I started on that B flat, that Rico Kuhn, I think I was just on my piston mouthpiece for that. There are some rotary makers that encourage trying a traditional Bach style mouthpiece, Rico Kuhn being one of them. And I don't know if it's kind of like a North German thing versus a, Bavarian, Austrian thing, because it seems like maybe, I've heard that from Weimann too. That like, yeah, just try your Bach mouthpiece.
I think it's also a question of them reacting to the market.
Yeah. You mean like, oh, this will sell more if people play their normal mouthpieces?
Weimann in America, right?
Yeah, right.
I certainly don't want to make this a brand discussion, but yeah, certain companies, like when I first played I was at Lechner, and I've told you the story that I was playing on my Bach 5 1B 5B, and Martin Jr. just said, "Can I? Would you try this?" He says, "This we think makes our horns sound most like we want them to sound." And I was sold in a heartbeat because everything about it became what I was looking for, and it made it easier.
And that was a Breselmeyer, right?
Breselmeyer G2, exactly.
Yeah, right. And that's what I would encourage any of my students, who buy a rotary trumpet. Usually, if they're in my studio, then I just bring in a whole, box of mouthpieces, and we have a lesson where they get to try all the mouthpieces and find what works. Interestingly, they tend to gravitate towards the mouthpieces that have worked well for me. I don't know if I found some, like that that P backbore, and the G2. I was using a G2B cup, but the G rim. At any rate, and then during the pandemic, I bought a ton of rotaries just so I could try them. They're so hard to get your hands on. We don't have access to them. You can't just go down to the local shop and I'd like to try 3 different brands of rotaries and see what I like. That doesn't exist. And so I just, scoured the used marketplaces and bought basically every brand that you can think of, at least one. But I also was just selling them too. And so I broke even, and I got to try a whole bunch of rotaries in my basement during the pandemic. Um, and so um, in the course of that, I think I was also tinkering with mouthpieces to try to find fits. And certainly with different makers, there are different mouthpieces that fit well. Um, and so for me, Breslaumeyer G2 is a great start. I also really like the JK 4D. That's I play that on my Rico Kuhn a lot. And then there have been some other Breslaumeers that I've discovered more recently that are different, and one that works well on my Lechner. And um, I gotta say, playing in all those halls, Mahler 1, Mahler 5 on tour, taking my rotaries with me to play guest in other orchestras. So I've gotten to play in Europe. I've played a few times with the Oslo Philharmonic. I've gone out and played with the Seoul Philharmonic. I've played guest in various, guest principal in various US orchestras, and a lot of times that's been on Rotary. And every time it seems that um, I think the rotaries are more sensitive to the acoustical environment than pistons. Pistons are just like it's like this is what it is what you get, and it's like it's kind of always the same, and you can sort of trust it in a dead closet or in a live big space, a church. It's like it always kind of feels the same. Maybe it's that direct compactness that you get right out the bell or something that you can just kind of latch onto. But the rotary, because of the way the sound fills the space and kind of works, I feel like it reacts to the space. It collaborates with the space. And so I think there are there are mouthpieces that feel like that, like the rotary mouthpieces that I was with you at Breslaumeyer that I picked out didn't work for me in the halls that that I played elsewhere. Um, and something that sounds like a little too harsh maybe without an audience in the hall will sound great once the audience is filled in, or um, just uh, I had a mouthpiece that I was using for the rest of our tour that I switched to mid tour. You heard it on Mahler 1 at the end of our tour. I immediately went to Oslo to play something with the Oslo Philharmonic. We did Brahms 2, and right away that mouthpiece was not working there. And I switched back to my JK that I had been on, and it had to do with the sound that the rest of the trumpet section was making and how that needed to fit, but also the room. And
so you think that that's not necessarily so much a case with piston trumpets?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's this apocryphal, maybe, but probably true story about Bud Herseth and Konrad Ingroth, Berlin Philharmonic principal trumpet player, having a beer in Berlin,
Yeah.
as trumpet players do. And Bud supposedly asked him to describe what he thought were the differences between what the difference in sound was, in his mind, between a regular piston trumpet and the standard rotary trumpet. And I've written this down because this is what Connie
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
He said, "This is a piston trumpet. This is a rotary trumpet."
Yeah.
And you would think, oh yeah, that's much better. But if you think about resonance in a hall, this, like you just said, this is going to be much more interactive with
Yeah.
the acoustics of something. And
Yeah.
I always think of that as being something you don't want to try to play like this if you're playing this horn,
Right.
and vice versa.
Right.
And they are different. No matter what anybody says, you can really create something quite unique with them.
Right. Right. And I think because it's a less penetrating quality, um, there there's there there's a little bit less of like me and my ego in the sound that I can clearly distinctly hear separated from all the other voices, identifiable, like that's the, you know, Micah Wilkinson first trumpet sound there, we're on the piston, that can cut and be very clear. And on the rotary, you kind of have to let that go. and,
Yeah.
and so then that's why I think it's more connective. So then you can like feel your sound latching on to, the bassoons or the violas in a way that, and the horns especially, um, in a way that, um, feels more integrated.
Yeah. I sometimes listening. I've been to Symphony Hall in Boston a number of times. Here at Boston Symphony, and I've heard L.A. there, and I've heard Berlin there. Strangely enough, a couple of times. And I've always felt like describing the difference in the trumpets. Let's say Boston and Berlin, and I'm not speaking qualitative here. I'm talking
Yeah,
about character here.
yeah,
Is that in in the Boston Symphony, the trumpets feel like penetrative, uh, focused light beams,
yeah,
you know, and not necessarily blending. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just they're very focused,
right,
like lasers or spotlights, right?
yeah,
Whereas in similar music, because I've heard Mahler from both of them,
yeah,
um, Berlin it's more liquid. The
hmm
the quality is broader. It's
hmm
not nearly as like in your face. Obviously, it's
hmm
definitely audible and heard, but it's a broader, more like mixed, like watercolor,
hmm
as opposed to something more pointillistic. And that's the character of the trumpets to a certain extent. And I always say this is not a right or wrong issue. This is what these horns are hopefully can do for people that want a sound to be a certain way. Um, I know American trumpet players a lot, especially like you mentioned with Minnesota and others. There's a certain grumpiness about being required to or asked to play something they're not comfortable with. But as we've, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, that was a big deal. But now it's like, this is life. This is part of your
yeah,
job. It's another tool or another weapon. We like to talk about
mm,
weapons as trumpet players. It's another thing in your arsenal. Piccolo trumpet, C trumpet, B flat trumpet, rotary. Probably rotary C for most people.
hmm
B flat is a really useful instrument in orchestra a lot of times.
hmm
And playing second on Beethoven on a B flat is really fun. You know,
yeah,
but it's got something that if we're going to, my philosophy has always been, if we're going to have to do this, if you're going to have to do this, try to make them sound as good as possible and enjoy the character of them, because they're wonderful sounding horns, and you just pick up any kind of orchestra recording you want, and you can hear great character.
absolutely, yeah.
Well, this has been fun. Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Because I've gone through my questions. I think we've been at this almost an hour. I think this is plenty long. A lot for people to digest, and hopefully, people can contact me certainly with questions if they have.
Yeah, you can
But
reach out to
anything
me
else?
through my website,
Yeah.
micahwilkinson.com. There's a access to email me through that. I'm not very active on social media these days, so that's probably
But
the
would
best
you
way.
please give me a list of the last few recordings Pittsburgh has put out? I own a
Sure.
few of them, and they're fabulous. I mean, I don't buy a
Thanks.
lot of, honestly, I don't buy a lot of American records because not a lot of companies are making real records.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
CDs. But your guys's are actually quite successful worldwide, and they're
hmm
wonderful.
hmm Yeah. Our most recent was the Bruckner 7, and that was the concert you attended.
Yep,
Um,
beautiful.
and before that was Tchaikovsky's Fifth, and also a suite of pieces by Schulhoff, um, that have some fun trumpet parts as well. That was all on piston.
Mhm.
Um, we released Brahms' Fourth
Great record.
and Beethoven 9,
Mhm.
Beethoven 6.
Did you do three as well?
I wasn't on that.
Okay,
That was right before I started.
okay.
Um,
Anything in the shoot coming out?
yeah, we recorded Schubert 8 and 9,
Awesome.
and Mozart Requiem, and Firebird,
That's not with rotors.
and the Turandot Suite. Firebird is not.
Yeah.
Neither is the Turandot Suite. Um,
And that's arranged by Honeck.
yeah, yeah. So
Turandot.
he's done a lot of
Okay.
these
We played that on
operas.
tour. I didn't get to hear it.
Yeah, that was part of our last tour.
That's
Some great,
fabulous.
great parts in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Trumpet parts in Turandot are awesome.
hmm so I think that's about it. We're gonna record Dvorak 9 in a couple weeks.
Hmm.
I head out of town for the next couple weeks, and I return right in time for that which we will do on Rotary.
Hmm.
Um, and then we record Shostakovich 10 at the end of the season. Um,
This is all with Honig.
all with Honig.
Yeah.
Yes. Um, I recorded second on Dvorak 8 and Dvorak 7 in the Houston Symphony on Rotary.
Hmm.
Um, so that,
And we didn't talk about your teaching.
yeah, I teach at Duquesne University during the year. I teach at the Chautauqua Institution during the summers. And I also play principal trumpet in that orchestra.
Hmm.
So that's a fun place for me to play a lot of repertoire in a relaxed environment. And we use a lot of rotaries there too.
Well, one more time, your email address or your website. What is
MicahWilkinson.com.
MicahWilkinson.com.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been a treat. I've been looking forward to this for a few months. We finally think
Yeah. Glad.
glad it's happening. The minute you got on the train and went away, or I went on the tram in Vienna, and I said, I need to. This is going to be a great interview. It's like we chatted about all this stuff for days,
Yeah.
and
Right.
it's like we're on the same page, and it's like this is what young trumpet players need is to hear this kind of stuff because then I get so many. I mean, I'm just this guy up in Maine, right? Uh, I get
But you
all
make the
these questions
videos.
about how to do this stuff, and I'm like, I haven't really done it the way other people have, but I have an idea. Let's do an interview with Micah's. And
Yeah.
like the
Sure.
minute I was on my tram leaving the hotel, I was like, shit, we're gonna do this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't I don't think I necessarily am an expert on this. I just like playing them, and I'm still learning a lot about it, and still discovering, you know, um, how to play them better, and how to what kind of situations I think that they would help me out. So I'm grateful that I play in an orchestra where it seems to be a really good fit. So it certainly aligns with the sound of the Pittsburgh Symphony um, and the direction things are heading.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording in a second, but we'll talk for a second right afterwards.
Sounds good. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks you. Thank you,
Bye,
Jack.
everybody.